Shrouded in a fog of frosted breath, the prophet crested the apex of the mountain pass, and when he turned back to appraise his progress, he saw the jungled heartland in all its untamed glory, sprawling before and beneath him. His flock formed a long, winding train that snaked for leagues down into the tree line. Their serpentine form reminded him of the great spirit that had inspired this pilgrimage. And no sooner than the prophet had this thought did the fount of inspiration Boethiah make her divine presence known. Her voice reverberated through the frigid peaks of the Valus Mountains, and in response, the snake grew deathly still. The head of every scale tilted to face the source of the resonance, for they knew well the deep, mellifluous tone of Boethiah, the same tone she had used to humiliate the liar Trinimac. From the ice, the deceiver emerged, and she did speak in secret with the prophet. She lay a reassuring hand upon sweet Veloth's weary face, and implored him to hold fast to his convictions. She warned him of what awaited his flock on the other side of the mountain range. This time, she did not coat her words in honey. She spoke solemnly, and Veloth listened. They would not find idyllic meadows and clement weather. Resdayn would vary from frozen tundra to fungal forest, to undulating lava flows, retching fumaroles and craggy badlands. Beautiful in its own right, but lacking the anuic tranquility of Somerset. This new world was a hive of chaos and limitation, and though Mount Vardenfell would spew noxious fumes and choking ash, the Dark Prince's voice was stern as stone when she stressed the significance of the volcano. Why though, Veloth did not yet know. Boethiah told him of the troubled house and its four corners, but the prophet was heartened, for the Dark Warrior and the other good Daedra swore to support them in their undying conflict with the malevolent Square. And lastly, she emphasised the Sigic endeavour, the philosophy that gilded their skin and made them Chimer. Mortality is a test, part of the missing god's grand design, and the challenges Veloth's flock would soon face were the stepping stones that paved the walking ways to royalty. She spoke of valiance, of high splendour, her saccharine lips uttering a syllable the prophet had never heard before, yet would not be heard again until Vivec's tryst with the Prince of Domination. And still, the syllable was so profound that it coincidentally became synonymous with the name of his people ever after. When Boethiah departed, the wall of ice barring Veloth's passage melted away, and the shepherd led his flock into the new world. And so begins the story of the Chimer, a tale of strife and betrayal, of conflict and curses, of dead gods and demigods. Welcome to the most fascinating land in the Elder Scrolls universe. This is the complete guide to Morrowind, its peoples, and its history. This new land named Resdayn was anything but free real estate, and as the Changed Ones attempted to settle in the late Malefic era, threats came from every angle. Of course, the geography, flora and fauna were the first of these dangers, but there were also a variety of races vying for territory. The Nords weren't a major problem yet, and wouldn't be for some time, but there is evidence of at least 3 other groups with an established presence in Resdayn. There were the Orcs, whose arrival in the region would have likely been contemporary with that of Veloth's people, since Boethiah's actions had created both the Chimer and the Orsimer, and these Orcs were outcasts, leaving Somerset in shame after Trinimac's debasement. The text titled "The True Nature of Orcs" states, "They fought Nords and Chimer for a place in the world, but did not get much." There are sources suggesting some Nedic settlements too, like Frontier Conquest, which claims these so-called Nedic peoples include the Proto-Cyrodiilians, the ancestors of the Bretons, the Aboriginals of Hammerfell, and perhaps a now vanished human population of Morrowind. There is also a Telvanni sorcerer named Vunal who speaks of a clash between Need and Chimer at the Battle of Stonefalls, though no date is provided, so he could simply be referring to conflicts with the Nords that occurred in the early First Era. The most perilous foe came from below. The Dwemer Deep Elves seem to have been thriving in Tamriel's northeast, though when exactly they came to the region isn't certain. But the province was also called Dwemereth prior to or around the time of the Chimer Exodus. Their unmistakable architecture dotted the land, and for every visible structure, there was a sprawling citadel beneath the soil. As the nomadic Chimer set up their temporary settlements on seemingly unclaimed terrain, there was likely an advanced Dwemer city directly underfoot. To make matters worse, the Chimer were obviously staunch followers of Boethiah, Mephala and Azura, the good Daedra, while the dwarves were a uniformly secular people. They were not atheist, for the existence of the gods was undeniable, but I would describe them as anti-theist. They acknowledged the gods, but did not view them as superior to mortals. Their technological innovations were so groundbreaking, I'm surprised their subterranean cities didn't collapse in on themselves. I'll save the bulk of this conversation for my upcoming deep dive into the Dwemer, but simply put, they would have had an innate distrust in any race that put so much faith in the divine. So, amicable relations were unlikely, and animosity was assured. Initially, the Chimer, in what became known as High Velothi culture, would have spent most of their efforts constructing monuments to their gods, and even some to the members of the House of Troubles. Towers built in this era still exist thousands of years after their construction. Boethiah taught the Chimer how to build these houses, and what items to bury in the corners. Mephala taught them how to evade their foes, and how to assassinate and manipulate. Azura taught them how to wear their skin, so that they would never be mistaken for high elves. But with the threat of rival cultures ever present, the Chimer could not hope to survive if they expended all their efforts and resources on the construction of temples and shrines. They needed to establish a dominant presence in Resdayn, not neglect self-preservation for devotion. High Velothi culture began to decline, not necessarily out of a lack of piety, but rather the need for a more pragmatic society. Unity was crucial for survival, and their efforts needed to be directed away from worship and into settlements that could endure on this harsh new frontier. They needed structured civilization and structured settlements, walls and defences, organisation. Thus the great houses were born. While each house was built on the foundations of High Velothi culture and the teachings of the good Daedra, the regions they came to inhabit, combined with the values of its influential members, caused each great house to germinate into a unique political party, with its own interests and ambitions. In the northwest, taking up residence in the foothills of the Velothi Mountains and one corner of Vardenfell, is Great House Redoran. House Redoran, sigil the scarab, house colour red, capital blacklight. House Redoran's values, according to the text Great Houses of Morrowind, include the virtues of duty, gravity and piety. Duty is to one's own honour, and to one's family and clan. Gravity is the essential seriousness of life. Life is hard, and events must be judged, endured, and reflected upon with due care and earnestness. Piety is respect for the gods and the virtues they represent. A light, careless life is not worth living. House Redoran produces the finest warriors in Morrowind, and this no doubt sprouts from their veneration for Boethiah. Of all the tests provided by the House of Troubles, and of all the steps of the Sigic endeavour, House Redoran is best suited to the physical ones. Vengeful Malakath tests the Chimer for physical weakness, and there are plenty of occasions throughout Morrowind's history, occasions we'll discuss later in this video, best suited to the strengths of House Redoran. Redoran architecture is discernible by its pragmatic, austere structures, built from the shells of the giant chitinous creatures inhabiting the land. Redoran warriors often assert that these shells are the remains of beasts they slew in the distant past. These kills are left unadorned, and depending on the size of the insect, the hollow interiors serve as homes, halls, and in rare cases like Ald'ruhn, entire districts can fit within the carcass. The Manor district of Ald'ruhn dwells within the shell of the ancient emperor crab named Scar. Scar had been a destructive force in the region, until the tribal ancestors of the great houses banded together to slay him. Redoran warriors are known for donning armour inspired by the arthropods of Morrowind, utilising guar leather and plates of chitin for optimal protection. They also favour Bonemold for its superior sturdiness, and that's a kind of armour we'll talk about more soon. Next we have House Hlaalu, House Redoran's southern neighbours. House Hlaalu, sigil the scales, house colour yellow, capital Narcissus. As the symbol of the scales suggests, House Hlaalu is somewhat less focused on the virtues of duty and piety and physical prowess, and is more interested in political manoeuvring, seizing opportunities to grasp influence, and value the rules of law and business over honour and modesty. This makes House Hlaalu noticeably more progressive and adaptable than its rivals. According to one councillor of House Hlaalu, singing the praises of his clan, "In the great wind of progress, tradition cannot stand. The Redoran may surpass us on the field of battle, but when the dust clears, they will find themselves indebted to us. Grasp fortune by the forelocks. When you see your chances, seize them. When you see a chance to turn a profit, take it." These individualistic, plutocratic values make House Hlaalu the most approachable Chimer house for foreign powers. And while it had little sway over the aggressive Nordic expansion we'll delve into soon, this would inevitably come into play with the rise of the Cyrodiilic Empire of Men, which, despite having colonial ambitions, actually wished to expand its influence without necessarily having to slaughter all of the locals. If the Chimer were to come to control Morrowind, and if they were to engage with the other Tamrielic races in any capacity other than warfare, it seems as though House Hlaalu would be at the forefront of such proceedings. Next comes House Indoril, under the leadership of the legendary saint and hortator Nerevar. House Indoril, sigil the wings, house colour blue, capital Mournhold. Historically, House Indoril are renowned for their orthodox beliefs and conservative attitudes, but those values are generally associated with House Indoril after the great paradigm shift of First Era 700 and the Tribunal's rise to prominence. Prior to this overwhelming societal restructuring, House Indoril presided over Morrowind's historic capital city, which lies right at the heart of the province. The text titled Understanding House Indoril states, "For House Indoril, religion stands as our most cherished institution. We revere our blessed ancestors. We honour the good Daedra, specifically Boethiah, Mephala and Azura, and we celebrate the saints, including Veloth and Aralor. House Indoril believes that Dunmer culture must be preserved at all costs. Change is the enemy of tradition, and it will weaken our strong foundation if we allow it to take root." But it's hard not to be struck by the irony of this claim, since House Indoril were the first to embrace the aforementioned religious and societal overhaul. Either way, House Indoril's role in the history of Morrowind is best saved for later. Next, we have House Dres, a house that has undeniably been shaped by the geopolitical climate of Morrowind's southern reaches. House Dres, sigil the shackles, house colour green, capital Tyr. The text Great Houses of Morrowind states, House Dres is an agrarian agricultural society, and its large salt rice plantations rely completely on slave labour for their economic viability. In the fertile southern plains of Deshaan, the land was ripe for reaping. So, enterprising members of House Dres quickly grew wealthy off the land, divvying up terrain and establishing vast estates. The fields became especially lucrative when the Chimer plantation owners began utilising one of the region's most abundant resources, Argonians. The lizard folk possessed opposable thumbs. They were not part of a well-organised society that could protect its people, and best of all, to the golden-skinned Chimer, they were clearly inferior in both appearance and intelligence. Why not put them to work? And so, the shackles became the symbol of the proud Dres proprietors. In their eyes, it was not a sign of their cruelty, but an indicator of business acumen. How could they be wrong when their pockets were brimming with coin? In time, Morrowind's diplomatic relations with the Cyrodiilic Empire would create tension between progressive houses, like House Hlaalu, and conservative houses like House Dres, who frankly don't care about the cosmopolitan values of the Heartland humans. But for now, in the Salt Rice Gold Rush, when the Chimer houses were flourishing unfettered by strict laws, House Dres quickly became one of the wealthiest in all Resdayn. According to the text titled Understanding House Dres, the isolationist stance of House Dres was instilled in its customs and world outlook from the very beginning. Last but not least, we have House Telvanni. House Telvanni, sigil the tower, house colour brown, capital Port Telvannis. In the words of the warrior poet Vivec, House Telvanni matches the disposition of my brother Sotha Sil, iconoclastic, profane, unconventional. In the far northeast of the province, along the rocky coastline, emperor parasol mushrooms jut skyward. While some grow naturally in this region, such mycological monoliths take thousands of years to reach their apexes. But the greatest Telvanni sorcerers are so in tune with the fungi that they can shape the mushrooms as they please, creating great hollow towers, perfect for reclusive wizards. They expend no effort building staircases for accessibility. If you wish to convene with a Telvanni wizard, you better learn how to levitate. The Telvanni base their values around the pursuit of wisdom. The most powerful wizards are supreme, and will not willingly follow the lead of lesser mer. When the great houses do convene, the elite among the Telvanni do not deign to attend, for they have far better uses for their time, like shutting themselves in their studies and carrying out some obscure research. Instead, the Telvanni wizards send their apprentices in their stead. These protégés or interns act as the wizard's mouth, and are therefore referred to quite literally as mouths at council meetings. The Telvanni loathe doctrines, whether ordained by the divine or imposed by the populace. Nothing should come between a free Chimer and their pursuit of power and knowledge. Thus, deference to any ruling body or obeisance to any god is mocked. The slave trade is also endorsed by the Telvanni, for any individual capable of being bound in chains clearly lacks the self-determination to achieve anything of significance anyway. The text titled Great Houses of Morrowind elaborates. The wizard lords of House Telvanni have traditionally isolated themselves, pursuing wisdom and mastery in solitude. According to Telvanni principles, the powerful define the standards of virtue. For the Telvanni, nothing is so sacred that it can be allowed to hinder innovation, and this is a virtue that the Telvanni share with their neighbours. No, not House Indoril to the south. I mean their subterranean neighbours, the Dwemer. The dwarves believe their creations rivaled the life-giving powers of the gods, and no accusations of blasphemy would stop them in their endeavours. Chief tonal architect Kagranak being the perfect example of this attitude, which we'll delve into soon. And since we're on the topic of the Dwemer, now would be a good time to mention that there were other houses, some smaller, some honorary, and others extinct. House Sadras warrants a mention, for they would replace the disgraced House Hlaalu in a few thousand years' time. House Dagoth shall not be mentioned nor mourned, but the eponymous lord of this house will rear his head very soon in the conflicts to come. Then there is House Dwemer, and as the name suggests, there came a time in Chimer-Dwemer relations when an alliance became necessary. Despite their differences, these elven races united against a common cause. But before the war horns of the dreaded Northmen sound, there are a few other aspects of Chimer culture to discuss. There were some Chimer who rejected the idea of dividing into great houses. They maintained their nomadic roots and tribal culture. While Great House Chimer learned to claim dominion over the land of Resdayn, the Ashlanders lived in harmony with it. The Ashlanders have simple lives, dwelling in hide yurts stretched over chitin frames. These temporary abodes can be dismantled with ease and packed atop their domesticated guars for travel. The portability of their lifestyle means that the Ashlanders, as their name suggests, can dwell in just about any of Resdayn's diverse biomes with ease, including the Isle of Vardenfell, where the craggy badlands are riddled with gas-spewing fumaroles, where flows of lava spring from fissures in the terrain like weeping wounds, where Red Mountain belches plumes of sulphur, and ash falls like snow. As far as the pious Ashlanders are concerned, to hide from the elements is to deny Dagon's corner of the House of Troubles. Each clan has an Ash Khan to lead them, as well as various wise women who lead them in spiritual matters, and pass on their ancient traditions and beliefs from generation to generation. They also interpret dreams as prophecy, and this deep spirituality and their lack of complacence compared to Great House Chimer is the primary reason they did not follow the rest of their race into eventually abandoning the old ways. They are proud and xenophobic. The Ashlanders venerate the good Daedra, unchanging throughout the millennia, but they also staunchly worship the ancestors of their tribes. To them, the good Daedra are but their earliest, most divine ancestors. Ancestor worship exists among all Chimer, and the Changed Ones are very particular with their burial rites. This largely comes down to the padomaic nature of the Chimer. While Aedric entities like Auriel and Trinomac espouse the idea that Mundus was a trap and that Aetherius was superior, the philosophy of Boethiah and the good Daedra was not so pessimistic. The mortal realm was a test, but Aetherius was not the end goal. Proper adherence to the Sigic endeavour allowed one to strive for far more than the afterlife. Therefore, death is not some finality, but one stage of the spiritual journey. Great House Chimer inter their dead in ancestral tombs, or in the City of the Dead, Necrom. Bodies are cremated so that they may become one with the ash. Some spirits are freed during this process, while others elect to have some part of them endure in an ethereal form, giving their remains to a ghost fence, which protects the family tomb. Ashlanders don't have such elaborate crypts, but instead build cairns to mark the burial place of the deceased's ashes. But while they differ on this factor, ancestor worship is one of the few shared values between Great House Chimer and Ashlanders. While the Ashlanders may be unbound by political plights, unshackled by burdens of land ownership and status, the House Chimer are not, and thus turn to the teachings of Mephala. When Boethiah devoured Trinomac and exposed the lies of the Atada, she garnered a following of Somerset's most free-thinking renegade Mer. To leave the familiar for distant lands required an immense amount of courage, but with the guidance of the good Daedra, the Changed Ones developed a society based around radical new ideas. I mentioned Boethiah's heavy involvement in this process, but Mephala also had a significant impact, especially on politics. The notion of great houses is hardly unique. All over Tamriel there are factions who form alliances and wage wars in the pursuit of land, power, and influence. But the Spinner has her own secret arts, ways of getting what she wants, and she imparted some of these secrets upon the Chimer. Mephala believes sex and murder are valuable tools for furthering one's ambitions, and as the text Vivec and Mephala asserts, all of these themes contain subtle aspects and violent ones. Assassination, genocide, courtship, orgy, tact, poetic truths. Mephala is understood paradoxically to contain and integrate these contradictory themes. She taught the Changed Ones not to shy away from assassination, but to embrace it. And so, a guild of assassins was introduced in Resdayn, operating in plain sight. This guild was called the Morag Tong. The text titled The Anticipation states, Mephala taught the Chimer to evade their enemies, or kill them with secret murder. Enemies were numerous in those days since the Chimer were few and beset with enemies on all sides. Mephala organised the clan systems that eventually became the Great Houses. Later, Mephala created the Morag Tong. Now, I'm sure when you think of assassins you think of the Dark Brotherhood. Despite their rituals, their peculiar hierarchy, their veneration of Sithis, and the role of the Night Mother, who might just be Mephala in disguise, their deeds are quite self-explanatory. Perform the Black Sacrament, and the Dark Brotherhood will carry out the will of the Invoker. In order to operate in Tamriel, the Dark Brotherhood are secretive. They dwell in the shadows and conceal their identities. The Morag Tong, on the other hand, waste no energy on remaining unseen. In fact, it's rather important that the Great Houses are well aware of their presence. The threat of lawful assassination keeps overzealousness to a minimum. The name is a pretty clear indicator of the guild's accepted place in Chimer society. Mora is the Old Merry word for forest or woodland, and Tong is the Chimer word for guild. The Morag Tong simply means the Forester's Guild. And this name has a few implications. A forester in our universe is someone who keeps the forest in check, who plants and manages and cares for the trees. Now, arguments can be made about how a forester should go about doing this, as there is an irony in the very notion of trees needing the support of mortals to flourish. But that's neither here nor there. There is great utility in maintaining the forest, at least utility for us mortals. There is a theory that thinning forests is beneficial to the flora, for instance, making room for new buds to burgeon. And to take it to another level, in Australia, controlled burnings are carried out in anticipation of dry summers, to prevent potential bushfires close to populated areas. Forestry in the context of the Morag Tong could be a metaphor for maintaining a cohesive society. Some trees grow too tall, their crowns too vast. The lack of sunlight penetrating the overstory causes unrest, and unrest is the domain of Mehrunes Dagon, one corner of the troubled house. So, the Morag Tong steps in. They prune the most ambitious shoots, not so much to discourage aspiration, but enough to ward off complacency and hubris. There is also the inevitable association with the forest and Hermaeus Mora. Some say the name Morag Tong must relate to him, since he is the woodland man and brother to Mephala. But I believe the prior explanation is adequate enough without delving into the relationship between Herma and Mephala. That is a topic I'll save for an upcoming video. The Tong is strictly impartial, all assassinations must be officially sanctioned, and there's even a paper trail. Receipts are drawn up called honourable writs of execution, which are legally recognised and exonerate the Tong of all culpability. While discretion is advised to avoid creating a scene, and guild members are masters of their trade, a Tong assassin will intentionally be caught red-handed, murder weapon in hand, before brandishing the honourable writ of execution. That way, there will be no confusion or paranoia regarding the nature of the kill, and the assassin can then walk away, leaving the mess to the poor chambermaid. The Chimer really are a unique people, and of course, one of the most obvious manifestations of this is their distinct aesthetics and culture. The strange flora, fungal forests, and alien fauna led the Chimer to innovate in ways that diverge drastically from every other Tamrielic race. Obviously, each race has their eccentricities. The Ayleids adopted avian motifs in their dress. The Nords constructed halls lofty enough to house dragons. The Dwemer used sound to shape their subterranean caverns, and steam to galvanise their automatons to animation. And yet, when we think of the weirder side of the Elder Scrolls, we think of the Chimer, aka Dunmer, and of Resdayn, aka Morrowind. Typically, particularly in tribal societies, we see architecture, dress, customs, diets, transportation, and much more develop from the resources immediately available. This is nothing new. The Northmen will protect themselves with boiled leather and warm themselves with the fur skinned from wolves and bears. They'll domesticate horses for work and transportation. They'll harvest honey to brew mead and eat a diet of gamey meat. But what happens when you have creshweed and salt rice in place of wheat and barley? What happens when you have netches and kwama in place of cows and rabbits? And why would you ride horses when you have guars and siltstriders? The changed ones eat kwama eggs and the meat from bantam guar. They drink fermented salt rice in the form of mazti. They use the reptilian guars as pack mules and arthropodic siltstriders for long-distance travel. And the prevalence of arthropods means that chitin is often preferred over metals for its abundance and lightweight protection. In place of cowhide, the Chimer make light armour from netch leather, and they even have a strange kind of heavy armour called Bonemold. I mentioned Bonemold earlier, but there is a haunting story worth telling about this material that really demonstrates just how alien this land really is. Bonemold has quite an unsettling origin story. Granted, the story is likely embellished, but it's the only known explanation and is worth a short digression. Bonemold crafting was invented by a noble elf named Arslik, and his name isn't even the most unsettling part. Arslik's lands were situated in a precarious region of Vardenfell, notorious for its infestation of Nordic cannibals. Naturally, he built a stronghold to keep the round-eared heathens at bay. Their eyes were wild, their teeth filed to dagger-like points, their forms draped in the skins of their victims, and they had their eyes on Arslik's domain. At first, the cannibals attacked Arslic's slaves in the fields, but soon grew brazen enough to assault the walls of his keep. Arslic was under siege, and the Nords were not as foolish as they were wild. They poisoned the stream that brought life to the settlement, which killed most of the settlement's serfs and livestock before Arslic was any the wiser. Any slaves Arslic sent to forage, or to find water further up the river, were swiftly killed and feasted upon. Fortunately, Arslic's armourer was a gifted slave named Gorklif, and he forged armour for the next foraging party. But the armoured slaves were too cumbersome in their steel and iron plates, so Arslic had a bright idea: to collect all the cadavers of poisoned livestock and make light armour from their leather. The animals had already begun their decay, and the rancid odour made the armour a wretch. This armour was more successful to an extent, but it was not sturdy enough to endure the battering from the cannibals and their clubs. Arslic needed medium armour, but the stronghold had a scarce supply of resources. The only things they had in abundance were the rotting corpses of slaves and livestock. Muscle, fat, blood and bone were all the commodities Arslic's settlement had access to. And so, Gorklif got to work, creating the first ever suits of Bonemold armour. But the Chimer take burial rites and reverence for the dead very seriously, and the spirits of the slaves used in this sacrilegious act endured, tormented. Gorklif heard voices emanating through the corridors at night. "Give me back my bones," they crooned. And when morning came, Arslic entered Gorklif's chamber to find the armourer sprawled across the bed. His face was sunken, his eyes gouged out. His body held no shape, a sack of skin with all its vital pieces stolen. And when Arslic turned to leave, the spirits seemed to bubble and simmer from the cracks in the walls. The undulating forms coalesced into shapes vaguely humanoid, and they demanded repayment. When finally the siege was lifted, Arslic's saviours found him in the armourer's chambers, legs behind his head, arms behind his legs, like a fine gown at the foot of the bed. Long story short, in this new land of Resdayn, the Changed Ones really were living up to their name, creating a civilization that surpassed the wildest imaginings of most Tamrielic races. But now we have our bases covered, it's time to move into the history of Resdayn, and from this point on, as we leave the ancient history of the Chimer, I'll refer to the province by its better known, likely imperialised name, Morrowind. We've mentioned a few times already the ongoing tensions between the Chimer and Dwemer, and there is no doubt that these peoples would have clashed until one ceased to exist. And let's be honest, it almost certainly would have been the Dwemer who emerged victorious. Nevertheless, such speculation is trivial, for a common threat reared its hoary head, and the former adversaries were soon forced to set aside their differences and cooperate to retaliate against a common foe. In the late Malefic era, around the time that the great houses of Morrowind were taking shape, the Northmen of Atmora were making waves in the Sea of Ghosts. After a spell of coexisting with the Fauna Snow Elves and a subsequent falling out, the Atmorans, under the leadership of Ysgramor, laid claim to all Skyrim and vowed to slaughter every elf in the north. Ysgramor and his 500 mighty companions were true to their word, and the bulk of the Fauna population was eradicated. Those who survived suffered a fate worse than death, a fate we'll be exploring in next week's video. Next, the Nords went to war with their draconic overlords, and against all odds achieved a Pyrrhic victory. So, with the Snow Elves and dragons out of the way, a period of prosperity began for the Nords. The First Empire of Men was founded. High King Vraga the Gifted launched campaigns on two fronts to capture High Rock and Morrowind. And miraculously, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed barbarians pulled it off. The Nords controlled Morrowind for 176 years, from First Era 240 to First Era 416. But there was one part of the province that never surrendered its sovereignty, the Isle of Vardenfell. The Pocket Guide First Edition comments, "The kingdom of Vardenfell remained strong at the time of the Nord conquest. The doughty dwarves, secure in their underground fastnesses and united into one polity, were a far more formidable foe than the divided and feuding Dark Elven clans, and remained independent when the rest of Morrowind fell to the Nords. These were trying times for the Chimer, and the great houses came together to elect a Hortator. In times of need, the houses may propose one Mer to act as the collective military leader, unifying the usually rival clans to form a stronger whole. This Hortator was Indoril Nerevar, and with the aid of his generals, he made an alliance with the dwarf king Jumak, forming the First Council. A personal friendship between Nerevar and Jumak made this difficult diplomatic endeavour possible. Conveniently, there had been great strife in Skyrim after the death of High King Borgus at the hands of the Bosmer Wild Hunt. Civil unrest had gripped the north, and the united force of Dwemer and Chimer capitalised on this, ending the Nordic occupation and bringing a time of peace to Morrowind. Thanks to the flourishing friendship of Nerevar and Jumak, the First Council endured beyond the conflict, and the relationship between the two races remained cordial. At least it did for 2.5 centuries, when the major contention between the two races resurfaced. The Dwemer and Chimer had never agreed on spiritual matters, but something was brewing beneath Red Mountain that took dwarven profanity to unforgivable new heights. Though Jumak Dwarfork was king of Vardenfell, Kagrenak was chief tonal architect. High priest, high engineer, he was at the forefront of dwarven innovation. So when miners at Red Mountain discovered a mysterious magical stone within the core of its volcano, the High Craft Lord was the first to be informed. Kagrenak deduced that this stone was actually the still-beating heart of a god, and I'm sure you can guess what a dwarf would do with this information. While the Chimer would have consulted their good Daedra, and by Boethiah's counsel, knelt in reverence before the heart, the Dwemer were not so fond of genuflection. Kagrenak did not kneel, he drew schematics, and began devising a plan to tap the artifact's power, with specially artificed tools. According to the last surviving Dwemer Yagram Bagan, the Dwemer were not unified in their thinking. Kagrenak and his tonal architects believed they could improve the Dwemer race. In his search for the secrets of immortality, Kagrenak sought to control supernatural forces that you might call divine. Some believed his tampering with such forces was profane and terribly dangerous. There are many theories regarding Kagrenak's goals, and what eventuated when finally he carried out his plan, but those are not relevant to this video. I do have a video covering the major Dwemer disappearance theories on the channel, which I'll link below, but what is relevant is that if Kagrenak's work became public knowledge, the Chimer would not consent to its continuation. There is much debate over whether Jumak was made aware of his high priest studies, but one thing that is well documented is that the Dwemer were not a hive mind, and there were plenty who would have considered the High Craft Lord's work too risky. So the idea that he kept it from the king is perfectly plausible. Nevertheless, word would get out, thanks to one conniving Chimer named Vorin Dagoth. How Vorin discovered the source of the divine resonations is not explicitly stated, but I posed my theory in my video on the Devil of Dagoth. For a deep dive into the false dreamer, check the description. I'll be referencing two parallel yet antithetical sources regarding the events of this war, one by the temple and one by the warrior poet Vivec. Vivec's account states, "But when Dagoth Ur, Lord of House Dagoth, and trusted as a friend by both Nerevar and the Dwemer, brought us proof that High Engineer Kagrenak of the Dwemer had discovered the Heart of Lorkhan, and that he had learned how to tap its powers, and was building a new god, a mockery of Chimer faith and a fearsome weapon. We all urged Nerevar to make war on the dwarves, and to destroy this threat to Chimer beliefs and security. But Nerevar and Jumak were close comrades, and Nerevar was troubled, for he could not fathom his friend betraying his trust so flagrantly." The temple's account adds, "He went to Jumak, his friend of old, and asked if what Dagoth Ur said was true. But Kagrenak and the high priests of the Dwemer had kept their new god secret from their king, and Jumak said the Dwemer were innocent of any wrongdoing. Nerevar Moon and Star was Azura's champion, and so he made pilgrimage to her shrine and beseeched her for guidance. The Queen of Dawn and Dusk did not confirm Jumak's complicity, but to a god that was of no consequence. What she did communicate to her champion is that the sacrilege was very real, and the blasphemy of the Dwemer had gone too far. She said that the new god of the Dwemer must be destroyed. The temple text continues. Finally, Nerevar, angered that his friend Jumak would lie to him, went back to Vardenfell. This time the Chimer king was arrayed in arms and armour, and had his hosts around him. And he spoke harshly to Jumak Dwarfork, king of Red Mountain. You must give up your worship of the Heart of Lorkhan, or I shall forget our friendship and the deeds that were accomplished in its name. And Jumak, who still knew nothing of Kagranak's new god, but proud and protective as ever of his people, said, We shall not relinquish that which has been our way for years beyond reckoning, just as the Chimer will not relinquish their ties to the lords and ladies of Oblivion. And to come at my door in this way, arrayed in arms and armour, and with your hosts around you, tells me you have already forgotten our friendship. Stand down, my sweet Nerevar, or I swear by the 15-1 golden tones, I shall kill you and all your people. And so, the War of the First Council commenced. Once again, the Chimer unified under the Hortator Nerevar, and even the Ashlanders followed him, for Azura had vouched for him. 32 years of conflict culminated at the climactic Battle of Red Mountain, and while the amassed armies clashed in the foothills, Nerevar led a group of his most trusted generals to the heavy brass doors of Jumak's citadel. With Vorin Dagoth in tow, Nerevar confronted Jumak and Kagranak in the Heart Chamber. What occurred within the Heart Chamber is one of the Elder Scrolls' greatest mysteries. We have varying accounts, we have denials and confessions, but however it unfolded, treachery was abound, and the fate of the Chimer and Dwemer races were forever changed. Nerevar clashed with his old friend Jumak, and both Mer took grievous wounds and were immobilized by draining magics. And it was in this moment that the wise High Engineer, one of the realm's most prolific enchanters, made the error that would undo all the achievements of dwarfkind in an instant. Vivec writes, with Jumak fallen and threatened by Dagoth Ur and others, Kagranak turned his tools upon the heart, and Nerevar said he saw Kagranak and all his Dwemer companions at once disappear from the world. Vorin Dagoth took up the tools and implored Nerevar to destroy them, lest they fall into the wrong hands and be used for evil. Nerevar consulted his queen and his generals, Almalexia, Vivec and Sotha Sil, and they told him to keep the tools, for what if the Dwemer should return and seek to harm them once again? Nerevar acquiesced, on the condition that they each swear a solemn oath upon Azura that the tools would never be used in the profane manner the Dwemer had intended. According to Vivec, the four then returned to the Heart Chamber, where Vorin Dagoth awaited with the tools. Vorin coveted the tools for himself, and betrayed Nerevar's trust. He was thus stripped of the tools and driven away, but Vivec failed to mention Nerevar's fate. The temple text offers an alternate account of the events of Azura's invocation. They made ritual as if to summon Azura as Nerevar wanted, but Almalexia used poisoned candles, and Sotha Sil used poison robes, and Vivec used poisoned invocations. Nerevar was murdered. Azura appeared before the three of them, Nerevar's beloved wife and queen, and two of his most trusted generals. Traitors all. She said, What you have done here today is foul beyond measure, and you will grow to regret it, for the lives of gods are not what mortals think, and matters that weigh only years to mortals weigh on gods forever. And so that they might know forever their wicked deeds, Azura changed the Chimer into Dunmer, and their skin turned ashen, and their eyes into fire. Let this mark remind you of your true selves who, like ghouls, fed on the nobility, heroism, and trust of their king. Vivec's account elucidates further, suggesting that Azura did not materialize at this moment, but rather the moment they turned the tools upon the Heart of Lorkhan, stealing divinity from the trickster god. Vivec writes, We transformed ourselves with the power of Kagranak's tools, and no sooner than we had completed our rituals and begun to discover our newfound powers, the Daedra Lord Azura appeared and cursed us for our forsworn oaths. By her powers of prophecy, she assured us that her champion, Nerevar, true to his oath, would return to punish us for our perfidy, and to make sure such profane knowledge might never again be used to mock and defy the will of the gods. But Sotha Sil said to her, The old gods are cruel and arbitrary, and distant from the hopes and fears of Mer. Your age is past. We are the new gods, born of the flesh, and wise and caring of the needs of our people. Spare us your frets and chiding in constant spirit. We are bold and fresh, and will not fear you." And in response to this insult, Azura's curse befell the Chimer. Their golden skins turned ashen, their amber eyes burst into fire. And Vivec recalls Azura saying, "This is not my act, but your act. You have chosen your fate, and the fate of your people, and all the Dunmer shall share your fate, from now to the end of time. You think yourselves gods, but you are blind, and all is darkness." Sotha Sil had obviously felt fear and doubt despite his impassioned response to his anticipation Azura, but there was still truth in his words. Darkness had fallen over the Chimer people, but Vivec, Almalexia and Sotha Sil had adopted some of the Dwemer heretical philosophy in utilising Khagrenac's tools. They were not gods in truth, but with their newfound powers, they could have a more tangible impact on Morrowind than the good Daedra ever could, for the Mundus was their home. There was no Akatosh Covenant or Lunar Lattice obstructing their deific influence, and they reassured themselves of this when they resurfaced from Jumac's citadel to build the new world of their dreams. Vivec continues, "And the new world we shaped was glorious and generous, and the worship of the Dunmer fervent and grateful. The Dunmer were at first afraid of their new faces, but Sotha Sil spoke to them, saying that it was not a curse, but a blessing, a sign of their changed natures, and sign of the special favour they might enjoy as new Mer. No longer barbarians trembling before ghosts and spirits, but civilised Mer, speaking directly to their immortal friends and patrons, the free faces of the Tribunal. And we were all inspired by Sotha Sil's speech and vision, and took heart. And over time, we crafted the customs and institutions of a just and honourable society, and the land of Resdayn knew millennia of peace, equity, and prosperity, unknown to other savage races." And this brings us to Tribunal Morrowind, a reign that lasted for most of the region's history, spanning the remaining 2200 years of the First Era, the entire Second Era, and all but 6 years of the Third Era, over 3,500 years in total. The Chimer people had built their identity on the skeleton of the good Daedra. Boethiah, Mephala, and Azura had each played an essential role in Chimeri spirituality, and the Tribunal knew they could not vie with the gods for the support of the masses. There was no choice but to suppress the old gods and establish themselves as the most powerful beings in Tamriel. This would be no easy feat, but a few astute decisions made the transition much smoother. Firstly, as Sotha Sil said, the people could directly interact with their immortal champions. Secondly, the good Daedra were loved, thus the Tribunal could not give the impression they were deposing them. If the newly transformed Dunmer came to the consensus that Almcivi were usurping Morrowind, then they would be swiftly torn down. Therefore, the good Daedra became known as the Anticipations, a title that suggested the Tribunal were not only aligned with the good Daedra, but their providential successors. For each good Daedra, there was a member of the Triune to fill their divine boots. The virtues of each Daedric prince were adopted by one of the three successors. The text titled The Anticipations provides an overview of each. Boethiah is the anticipation of Almalexia, but male to her female. Azura is the anticipation of Sotha Sil, but female to his male. Mephala is the anticipation of Vivec, but manifold and androgynous. Almalexia embodies the quintessential elements of Boethiah. Almalexia is a warrior, a matron, a protector. She is Mother Morrowind, and there is no love more vehement than that of a mother to her children. In all her beatific brilliance, Almalexia maintained the golden hue of the Chimer, even after Azura's curse took hold. Almalexia loved Nerevar as Boethiah loved Lorkhan, and it was the intensity of her love that made her the perfect figurehead for this new Morrowind. A face so beautiful that the Dunmer would always rally behind her, but a force to be reckoned with for Outlanders. Almalexia safeguarded Morrowind on countless occasions, two noteworthy instances being her clash with Mehrunes Dagon in Mournhold, and leading the Dunmer in the midst of an Akaviri invasion. Sotha Sil is a clockwork enigma. whose meticulousness is applied to all things, including his own mind and motivations. Just as his anticipation, Azura, is associated with mystery and magic, fate and prophecy, Sotha Sil is the father of mysteries, a magician and a maker. Azura's blessing created the Chimer from the Ultima, and her curse created the Dunmer from the Chimer. Sotha Sil too is a creator akin to the Dwemer, potentially surpassing them in many respects. He saw the flawed mundus, the imperfections of gods and mortals, and he shut himself away to mend these things, to create perfect things that pleased him. But as his grey skin suggests, he is the most penitent among the Tribunal. His wisdom was fundamental in shaping Morrowind. It was his research that allowed Kagranak's tools to be used without catastrophic repercussions. But he remains withdrawn, and his role in the Battle of Red Mountain continues to constrict around his conscience. And in this regard, he is quite unlike his anticipation, for he does not seek to satiate his vanity with the adoration of the people. He actively avoids it. On the concept of ruling, Sotha Sil has this to say: "I am whatever the people need me to be, a guardian, an oppressor, for some too distant, for others too meddlesome. I am the canvas upon which they paint their dreams and resentments, a vessel for their hopes and doubts, a mirror, nothing more." Almalexia adores her divinity. Vivec's pursuit of freedom and understanding means he does too. But Sotha Sil does not. He appreciates what it allows him to do, but by the end, he was ready to put down his burden. Perhaps this is the fundamental similarity between Sotha Sil and Azura. She warned the Tribunal that the lives of gods are not what mortals think, and matters that weigh only years to mortals weigh on gods forever. And of the Triune, only Set truly came to feel the weight of these words. When finally the Clockwork God's time came, Azura said solemnly, "Weep not for Sotha Sil. He shed his mortality long ago, and I am certain his death was no small relief to him. These gods lived with the burden of a power no mortal was meant to possess." Vivec is at once a poet and a warrior, a philosopher and a killer, male and female. Like Mephala, he possesses subtle aspects and violent ones. He represents the duality of his anticipation, and of the Dunmer people as a whole, and as such, his earthly form is cloven, one half golden, one half dun grey. While Almalexia serves as the face of the Tribunal's glory, and Sotha Sil is more reclusive, Vivec occupies both spaces. He is generally perceived by the Dunmer to be a benevolent and conscientious king, yet he performs darker deeds as well that must be kept from the public eye, ensuring both through kind acts and manipulative ones that the Dunmer never falter in their devotion to the Tribunal temple. A good example being the floating celestial rock named Bar Dao. It is believed that this meteor, which looms ominously over Vivec city, was sent by the mad god of the troubled house, Sheogorath. Instead of dispatching with the peril, Vivec allows it to remain suspended in the air, a constant reminder of the magnanimity of Almcivi. In his sermons, Vivec addresses the threat. "I shall keep it there with its last intention intact, so that if the love of the people of this city for me ever disappears, so shall the power that holds back their destruction." Vivec was unafraid to wield the divine powers the Heart of Lorkhan had bestowed upon him. But unlike Almalexia, he did give himself entirely to them. He relished in his royalty, in the secret astral syllable of liberty that is Kim, yet strove to remain grounded to his mortal identity. Part of this grounding was to contemplate his sins, even his most egregious, that which he calls foul murder. In the words of his dear friend Sotha Sil, Vivec craves radical freedom, the death of all limits and restrictions. He wishes to be all things at all times, every race, every gender, every hero, both divine and finite, but in the end, he can only be Vivec. There is much more that can be said for each member of the Tribunal, but this video is on the land they governed, and each deserves their own dedicated video. Morrowind retained the Great House structure, but was unified under the Tribunal Temple. Only the Ashlanders rejected this new religion, and chose to continue worshipping the good Daedra. The temple hierarchy placed Almsivi at the apex, the most sublime and unassailable of figures. But the temple also preached veneration of saints, ancestors, and of course the good Daedra, who were the first ancestors. The greater saints are all well known, including the Triune themselves, as well as Saint Nerevar the Captain and Saint Veloth the Pilgrim. There were also various lesser saints, canonized by the Tribunal Temple for admirable feats during their lives. The religion was enforced by priest soldiers called the Ordinators. These holy guards don the visage of Saint Nerevar and carry out the will of the Tribunal across Morrowind. It is an irony only Almsivi are privy to. Their worship is secured by the face of the Mer they slew in cold blood before the divine spark of Lorkhan, whose heart maintained its steady rhythm, while Nerevar's ceased. There are 4 distinct Ordinator orders. The Order of the Watch protects Tribunal temples and shrines. The Order of War takes an active role in combating adversaries of the Tribunal, though this predominantly sees them stationed on the Isle of Vardenfell, for reasons we'll discuss shortly. The Order of the Inquisition roots out corruption within the temple, punishing any heresy wherever it rears its head. Finally, the Order of Doctrine and Ordination deals with dissidents outside of the temple, such as those who proclaim the legitimacy of the Nerevarine prophecy. Within the Tribunal Temple, there was a secret cult called the Dissident Priests, devoted to spreading the truth about how the Tribunal attained their divinity. And the Ashlanders, who never conformed to Great House politics, preach the lost prophecy of the Nerevarine, a topic we'll talk more on soon. Prior to her ascent to godhood, Almalexia had been Indoril Almalexia, wife to Nerevar. Now that Almsivi were the demigod rulers of the land, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that House Indoril became especially influential, and a significant majority of Morrowind's Ordinators hail from this great house. The most illustrious Ordinators served as High Ordinators in the capital of Mournhold, and Mother Morrowind even had her own private sect, the Hands of Almalexia. Further to the north, in Vivec city, the warrior poet had his own military order, the Buoyant Armigers. While they served Lord Vivec primarily, they possessed their master's innate curiosity, and were encouraged to fill themselves with the heroic spirit of adventure, performing chivalric duties as well as protecting their demi-divine master. But the Tribunal was more than just a cult of personality. They justified their leadership. I mentioned the Akaviri invasion, but another great feat of the Tribunal was stopping the seemingly unstoppable force of Tiber Septim from conquering the east. In the late Second Era, the Septim Empire had conquered much of Tamriel, but for Morrowind, Blackmarsh and Somerset. Blackmarsh was declared conquered, when in reality, no man nor elf could ever truly conquer it. Tiber Septim was hesitant to go to war with a province led by free living gods, but ultimately the two superpowers clashed. At the height of their majesty, the Tribunal would have almost certainly crushed Talos and his Cyrodiilic Empire, but their power was waning, and the sides came to a standstill. Eventually, to cease the bloodshed, an armistice was signed. Vivec, who had once called forth a flood to drown the Snakemen of Akavir, now exercised his diplomatic side, spearheading the negotiations. Morrowind maintained their right to follow their own established laws and customs, including slavery. The great houses would maintain local governmental control, and the Tribunal could not be trifled with, while the Empire could keep up appearances by electing a figurehead king, and would keep a military presence within the province. This was a prosperous time for House Hlaalu, for they were the most progressive and cosmopolitan of the great houses. The most important term of the agreement, however, was the exchange of the Numidium. The brass god was dismantled in secret and given to Tiber Septim, who utilised it in his conquest of Somerset. With the diplomatic and martial strength of Tribunal Morrowind, and all the layers of religious protection in mind, it's hard to imagine how such a theocratic regime could possibly falter. But all the while, there had been a threat to the Tribunal lurking within Red Mountain, the fount from which Almsivi draw their divinity. And the blight had been running rampant, emanating not by coincidence from the same volcanic wellspring. Frequent pilgrimages were necessary for the Tribunal to revitalise their immortal powers, but there was one ancient enemy obstructing them, the Devil of Dagoth. All those years ago, when the Dwemer had disappeared and Nerevar had been slain, Vorin Dagoth had been there. When the Tribunal approached the Heart, ready to tap its divine power, Vorin had stood in their way. Whether he was driven away or killed was unclear at the time, but the truth is that Dagoth Ur had endured. Vivec writes in his account of the Battle of Red Mountain, "Beneath Red Mountain, Dagoth Ur had survived. And even as the light of our bold new world shined ever more brightly, beneath Red Mountain the darkness gathered, a darkness that was close kin to the bright light that Sotha Sil coaxed from the Heart of Lorkhan with the tools of Kagrenak. As the darkness grew, we fought it, and crafted walls to confine it, but we never could destroy it, for the source of the darkness was the same source as the source of our own divine inspiration. Dagoth Ur undermined the power of the Tribunal, cutting them off from the divine spark. Dagoth Ur emerged from his long sleep, and along with him, members of his forgotten house were roused. From the maw of the mountain spewed the corporous blight, what Dagoth called the divine disease. Dunmer, who contracted the blight, suffered sickness of the soul, and disfiguration beyond the victim's worst nightmares. But to Dagoth, these nightmares were blessed dreams, and on these blight winds, Dagoth Ur aimed to broadcast his divine power. After many fruitless attempts to stop Dagoth and his enlightened zombies, the Tribunal realised the best they could do was contain him. To protect the populace, they erected a great ghost fence around the mountain. I mentioned ghost fences earlier in the video. A deceased Dunmer may offer some of their remains to protect a family tomb, sacrificing some of their own post-mortem peace, so that their family shrine will be free from physical and spiritual disturbances. This usually means a small bone fragment is not cremated and is incorporated with solemn magic and ceremony to strengthen the fence. In more exceptional cases, entire skeletons or even preserved corpses are bound to the fence. Making such a sacrifice for one's family is noble, but a great amount of devotion would be required to do so for your country. In order for the Great Ghost Fence to keep Dagoth Ur and the Blight contained, many heroes of the temple, mostly hailing from the houses of Indoril and Redoran, took the Tribunal as their surrogate families, and gave their spirits to the cause. Bones were also taken from the catacombs of Necrom and the many historic battlefields of Morrowind. Dagoth Ur and most of the corporous abominations were sealed within the fence, but the blight storms would continue to billow from the mouth of the volcano, and the Tribunal would continue to wither. Vivec writes, "And in these latter days of Morrowind, reduced to a subjugated province of the Western Empire, as the glory of the temple fades and the dark tide rises from Red Mountain, we are reminded of Azura and her promised champion's return. We have waited, blind and in darkness, mere shadows drained of our ardent vision, in shame of our folly, in fear of our judgment, and in hope of our deliverance. And so, as promised by the Queen of Dawn and Dusk, Morrowind awaits its prophesied hero. Morrowind awaits the Nerevarine." The prophecy comes from thousands of years of oral tradition, and thus varies in the telling. Such is the magic of the spoken word. Most common are the 7 visions. What he puts his hand to, that shall be done. What is left undone, that shall be done. First trial. On a certain day to uncertain parents, incarnate moon and star are born. Second trial. Neither blight nor age can harm him. The curse of flesh before him flies. Third trial. In caverns dark, Azura's eye sees, and makes to shine the moon and star. Fourth trial. A stranger's voice unites the houses. 3 halls call him Hortator. Fifth trial. A stranger's hand unites the Velothi. 4 tribes call him Nerevarine. Sixth trial. He honours blood of the tribe unmourned. He eats their sin and is reborn. Seventh trial. His mercy frees the cursed false gods, binds the broken, redeems the mad. He speaks the law for Veloth's people. He speaks for their land and names them great. The prophecy suggests an outlander will come to the shores of Vvardenfell. They will be unaffected by the blight. They will be blessed by Azura, and will don the enchanted ring Moon and Star, once worn by Indoril Nerevar, that can be worn by none other. They will unite the houses and the tribes. As Hortator, they will confront the Devil of Dagoth, and bring an end to the reign of the false gods. And so it went. The Nerevarine freed Dagoth Ur from his undeath, and freed the Heart of Lorkhan from those who drank in its celestial power. The return to mortality drove Almalexia mad, and she turned on Sotha Sil, though rumour has it the clockwork god left a successor. Vivec's fate is less certain, though he told the Nerevarine that he planned to withdraw from the world. Without Vivec's magic, the meteor Bar Dao finally finished its descent. Vivec's city was annihilated, and the devastation of its impact in the 5th year of the 4th era caused Red Mountain to erupt. Vvardenfell became nigh inhospitable, but the tremors of Bar Dao's impact were felt all over Morrowind. Even in the southern lands of House Dres, there were major earthquakes and floods. Mehrunes Dagon's corner was in full swing. The catastrophe, combined with the absence of Morrowind's demigod leaders, left the province in turmoil. With the Tribunal gone, and the Red Year ensuring that little sympathy remained for Almsevi, the Ashlanders were vindicated, and the good Daedra returned in the form of the Reclamations. But before the Dunmer could properly unify under their ancient Daedric ancestors, more misfortune befell them. You see, the Argonians of Blackmarsh, despite historically being oppressed and enslaved by the Dark Elves, were in a position of great strength. Not only had Morrowind endured the loss of the Tribunal and the Red Year, but between those two events, the Oblivion Crisis had also occurred, and Morrowind suffered dearly during this apocalyptic event. The Cyrodiilic Empire had long kept a military presence in the east, occupying many of Morrowind's most strategically positioned forts. But when the crisis began, the Imperials withdrew all of their garrisons, leaving the Dunmer to fend for themselves. It's only thanks to the quality of their mages and warriors that Morrowind wasn't completely razed to the ground by Daedra hordes. The Argonians, however, had fared better than any other race on Tamriel, bar none. Their hissed overlords had warned them of the impending invasion, and the lizard folk had been so well prepared that they actually chased the Daedra back through their Oblivion gates. So, after the Red Year, the Argonians couldn't help but notice that Morrowind was ripe for the taking, and they were even morally justified in launching an invasion, for there were masses of enslaved beasts that would be freed along the warpath. The Argonians have always been more focused on protecting their own corner of Tamriel, tending to the Hist and keeping the swamps free from foreign influence. But with the zealous Anziliel party at the forefront, the Argonians were able to take orders directly from their own kind, rather than waiting for the will of the Hist to be scrupulously interpreted by the sap speakers and tree minders. 1 year after the eruption of Red Mountain, in 4th Era 6, the Accession War began, and Argonian forces pushed north into the Dashan Plains. Much of Morrowind was sacked by the lizard folk, even the capital of Mournhold fell. The Argonians reached as far as the southern shores of Vvardenfell, where Vivec City had once been, and Scaving Bay was now. The invaders even made it into Telvanni territory, for the realm of the Wizard Lords had been ravaged during the Red Year. The Argonians nearly erased House Telvanni from Morrowind entirely, and it seemed as though their invasion would destroy the province beyond repair. But the invasion was eventually stopped in its tracks by House Redoran. The House of Duty and Honour and Warrior Virtues defied all the odds. Despite all the hardships they too had faced in the aftermath of the Red Year, they rallied together to stop the spread of the Argonians. They might have ended the invasion, but it would take over 40 years to send the bulk of the lizards back to the swamps. The Redoran capital of Blacklight became the capital of Morrowind, and the remainder of the 4th Era was spent slowly trying to re-establish Dunmer control over the land. Even though 150 years passed between the end of the Accession War and the events of Skyrim, Morrowind remains a shadow of its former glory. House Hlaalu was disgraced after the Dunmer lost all faith in the Empire, leading to their subsequent removal from the Grand Council. Much of Morrowind's population had been forced to flee from the chaos filling every corner of their homeland. Only House Redoran seems to possess any kind of structure. The text titled The Reclamations, The Fall of the Tribunal, and the Rise of the New Temple states, "The rise of the New Temple almost completely vindicated the previously persecuted Ashlanders, who had continued to worship the Free Daedra throughout the Tribunal's rule. The Ashlanders are now lauded as the keepers of the old ways and having true vision. It is now quite common for many of the Dunmer people to make the arduous pilgrimages into the Ash Wastes to seek the counsel of the wise women. These women have supposedly opened the eyes of those who they claim were blinded by the Tribunal, and directly connect the eruption of Red Mountain and the Argonian invasion to the anger of the Free Daedra. House Indoril, whose fortunes were so entwined with the Tribunal Temple, suffered greatly from its fall. While House Indoril still technically exists, the priesthood of the temple are now considered one and the same with House Indoril. Those who become priests are now considered to have joined Indoril. The political power of the Indoril has thus passed entirely into the hands of the temple, although members of the old House Indoril are still overrepresented in the priesthood. The rise of the new temple has a number of parallels with the rise of House Redoran. Each filled the vacuum of power resulting from the crisis of Red Year. How durable these new arrangements will prove, religious and political, remains to be seen. The span of 2 centuries is quite brief in the long history of the ancient Dunmer people. The question is, can the Dunmer people rise from the ashes and restore Morrowind to prosperity? Well, to answer that, I believe we must look at the reclamations, to the gods the Dunmer had foolishly neglected for so very long. When the Velothi people came to Resdayn, Boethiah had warned them that this was a land of chaos, a land rife with the influence of the troubled house. But Veloth had been heartened, for Boethiah had also emphasised the Psijic endeavour, the philosophy that gilded their skin and made them Chimer. Mortality was a test, part of the missing god's grand design, and the challenges Veloth's flock faced were the stepping stones that paved the walking ways to royalty. It's time for the Dunmer to return to their roots, perhaps with sufficient piety, with the wisdom of the good Daedra behind their every deed. The dun grey-skinned elves may become golden again. And that brings us to the end of my complete guide to Morrowind. The story of this fascinating land is far from over, and I look forward to telling the rest when the day comes that Bethesda graces us with the next chapter. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to support the content, there's a link to my Patreon in the description, though please only pledge if you can comfortably afford to. Thanks again. My name is Drew, you've been watching Drewmora, and I'll see you in the next one.